All right, we have hit the airwaves. Hopefully, we get a couple people trickling into the comments. Yeah, I figured this was going to be a really interesting one because you always get videos from those people. I've been reading comics for 50 years. Like, great, congratulations! You have the same outdated opinion as everybody else. So I was like, when we obviously, we've been talking about setting something up for a while now. And I was just like, okay, so what's a conversation that is sort of very specific to where we're coming into comics? And it's like, I definitely got the impression that, like, I mean, I only started reading monthly comics during the New 52, during the middle of the New 52. And from what I've heard from you, you started reading comics probably somewhere around the same time, collecting perhaps later than I was. But
Yeah, so for the lines, I really didn't start reading comics like in consecutive order until the Flash Rebirth. That's really when I started diving in, and then it was only the Flash Rebirth until honestly I started the comic book channel. Once I started the channel up, that's when I started picking up Marvel. That's when I started picking up DC. That's when I started picking up indie comics and really diving into their lines. And as the time has progressed, I've gone back and read lines like Dark Side War and Blackest Night, so on and so forth. The really major ones that are super important, moving forward in the current era. But yeah, outside of that, but anything 2000 and prior, I probably haven't read.
Yeah. And I mean, it's both a blessing and a curse, because, you'll get that fair group of just really disgruntled comic book readers that are like, but you didn't read this now, did you? But then it's also like, you're not tethered down to outdated stories. Like I've met a lot of people doing this that are like, well, this isn't in line with Jim Starlin's Infinity Gauntlet from 25 years ago. See? It's like, well, it's 25 years old. And it's like the sensibilities are outdated. We're in the future. Why don't we tell stories as if we were in the future? And so that's I think is the sort of basis as to what makes this conversation so interesting. So before we get super into it, I'm going to intro us up, say hello to everybody in the chat as they continue to roll in, and we'll get the show moving. But hey, guys, welcome to the 70th episode of Let's Talk Comics, where myself and another co-host in the comic book community discuss one of the many facets of the storytelling medium, that is comics. Whether it be stories, creators, constructs, adaptations, we hit it all. This week, I am glad to be joined by the one and only Bryan from Comic Breakdown. This has been a conversation that's been in the works for a little while, so I'm glad to have you here, man.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I've been waiting to get on this channel for a while now. You're one of the first people I met in the YouTube sphere of comic book creators and such. So yeah, it's really nice to be on here finally.
Absolutely, man. And just in case anybody's watching this and isn't super aware of your channel, Bryan, do you want to just give them a quick little cliff notes of what you do on Comic Breakdown?
Yeah, so I do Comic Breakdown. The channel's been going for almost a year now. Coming on April 4th will be the day I posted my first video. Nice. We just cover DC Comics. We keep up with current lines. Same with Marvel. We keep covering the King in Black, Infinite Frontier, all that good stuff. And then on weekends, we cover indie comics. We put an indie creator in the spotlight. We've covered your comic, Area 51, the Helix Project. We've covered, a bunch of other ones like Operation Eclipse from Unparalleled Comics. There's just so many out there. So yeah, that's really we just talk about the comics. I give you, a rundown of the comic, and then I give you my thoughts afterwards.
Super dope. Yeah, make sure you guys go check him out. There's a link in the description to Bryan's channel below. And also, as he mentioned, he was kind enough to sit down and talk to me a little bit about Area 51, the Helix Project, not too long ago. And he's also done a review on the first issue. So you guys should definitely go check that out. Go support his channel. And if you are a little bit standoffish about checking out the book, that is a good way to get some really, really nice, juicy information about the story. And while you're here, there is a link in the description to go back Area 51, the Helix Project, right now on Kickstarter. Second issue is out. You're also easily available to it's easily available to get issue 1 through this campaign. I've done my best to put a lot of value into this, make a meaningful story wrapped in sci-fi conspiracy surrounding a government operation called the Helix Project, where they take extraterrestrial DNA, implant it into soldiers, and create super soldiers that are able, excuse me, to manipulate their DNA on a molecular level, told in the super tumultuous 70s. So I think that you guys will really enjoy it. If you haven't already, please consider giving it a look. I am pouring myself into that story completely. I've done my best to assemble a team of creators that take this vision and bring it into something that I think is entirely better than the sum of its parts. So consider giving that a look. Link in the description. And if you can't buy it, a share goes a really long way. So please consider showing a couple friends. And Bryan has read it. And if you don't trust my word, trust his.
It's phenomenal. My channel definitely will do spoilers, but it's worth checking out because I love it. The artwork alone will, like, if you had no dialogue in that and just sold it on the artwork alone, it would be fantastic. But the dialogue going with it just makes it absolutely phenomenal.
Yes, sir.
It's so fantastic.
Thank you, man. Yeah, and if you guys can see now behind me are a couple snippets of some artwork from the project, please consider giving a look at that. And with that, we'll get into some of these live comments here. We got Abhi Krishna saying, hi, what's up? What's going on, buddy? How are you? The Real Manos, what's going on, man? Welcome to the show. BT Productions, what's going on, buddy? Let's see. The Real Mono says, I've been reading comics since 1970, and I always try to stay open to new ideas without forgetting the past. It's a tricky balance. I can certainly agree with you. You know, I've been reading comics for shy of a decade now, probably about 7 years. And I find that now that I've taken in so much and I've read just piles and piles of stories from modern age to the Bronze Age to the Silver Age to the Golden Age, I found myself kind of having to balance expectations and to make sure to acknowledge sort of the context behind those stories. You know, I was actually on the beginning of Frank Miller's Daredevil, I used to be really hard on it because people would talk about it in such a pedestalizing way, and it deserves to be that way. But it wasn't until I actually went back, read the Stan Lee Daredevil into Frank Miller, where I realized, oh, this is a leap. I mean, when you look at where this sort of level of storytelling was in something like Stan Lee's Daredevil, and then you see where Frank Miller is at, it's a whole nother playing field. Just the smoothness of prose, the consciousness of how the page is being set up. It's like, I mean, it literally felt like you were moving a century into the future. So I don't know. I've also just, I mean, I've definitely been accused of having a hard time reading super old stories because they're kind of out of date. And I think that part of it stems from the fact that back in the day, comics weren't really considered as much of a fulfilling art form. You know, like they looked at comics and like, yeah, we're gonna tell, you know, the penny stories. And you know, somewhere around the late 80s, early 90s, people started realizing, no, comics are a fruitful medium, you know, that you can tell high art stories that are just like sopping with authorship. I don't know, like, so Bryan, I know you were saying earlier you haven't gone too far back, but what's your experience when you do try to walk back into the sort of earlier stories in comics?
All right, so I think we've actually talked about this before. I am a sucker for not reading something that doesn't have good artwork. So when it comes to like not great artwork, I may not pick it up, and that's definitely what comes into play with some of this older stuff because I just don't have the artistic appreciation for what it takes, you know, to draw and stuff of that nature. Just because I'm not a drawer, you know, I that's not something I do. So for me, I can't really connect the appreciation to something like something Jack Kirby created or, you know, something of that nature. But I do understand the importance of individuals like Alan Scott and Jay Garrick, you know, the original, you know, Justice Society, all that stuff that really laid the groundwork to build comics to where they are today. You know,
Yeah.
and I've gone into the history of all of the DC, Marvel, indie comic creators as it's come up, and I understand the importance of all of it, and I absolutely love a lot of it. There's just a lot of it's hard for me to read because the artwork is so bad. Because, you know, maybe I picked up a comic the other day and it felt like a just newspaper in my hands, and it was just like, this is so hard for me to just sit here and read through. But I understand that's all there was at that one point in time, so people absolutely loved it.
Yeah, and it's
And
looking at it
hold
in
on,
context.
one more sec. The real Manos, he actually is a comic creator himself. He created the Red Knight. It's
Hmm.
an awesome comic. If you guys haven't checked that one out as well, indie comic creator, fantastic comic.
Cool. All right. Yeah. I mean, it's all in context, and quick shout out to Joe's Geek Show joining us in the chat. What's going on, brother? I think it's all in context, and you look at what comics were at the time and who was really looking to push the boundaries and tell stories that were creatively satisfying. I mean, they were looked at as cheap entertainment for children and for barely literate soldiers going overseas. Um, and obviously I think, yeah, sometimes it is hard to kind of get through some of that stuff. And I'm I have never ever been called a forgiving comic book reader. I'm very sort of critical because I am, an up and coming writer, and I do like to look at these stories as a means to study the craft, right, and how to be better at what I want to do. But again, being cognizant of what was sort of what the perception of comics were at the time, because back then a lot of people considered them throwaway stories. People wouldn't even like to admit that they were cartoonists. I mean, I've seen multiple interviews of Stan Lee where in the beginning he would just say he was a writer. What'd you write? I write books,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where he would stop it at, and then he ended up becoming the mouthpiece for comics. So looking at things in the greater context of the time, I think, is super important. For example, early Golden Age Batman stuff. For the time, Bill Finger, man, was just revolutionizing what comics were from the ground floor, literally in 1939, and that's kind of incredible. Although he did have to fit a very sort of specific tone because they could only go so far back then. There was a lot there that was already beginning to innovate. And then you get into the guys, like the Jack Kirbys, who, were just brilliant. And I can see why somebody wouldn't love Jack Kirby's work, because it took me a long time to really truly learn how to appreciate him. And it's difficult when you live in a world of Jim Lee's and Tony Daniels and so on and so forth, and you see something like Jack. But what was so brilliant about Jack is that he is the sort of basic building block that all of your favorite comic book artists stepped off from, and aside from I mean, I could just go on about Jack Kirby because of just how brilliant he was. He was the greatest idea man I think comic books ever had. He just didn't know how to channel it very well. But this isn't the Jack Kirby episode, so I'm going to leave the Jack Kirby stuff behind, address a couple more live chats here. The Geek Fortress, hello, beautiful people. What's going on, Lewis? Good to see you here, buddy. Tevia Smoker just saying, hey, what's going on? Regarding Golden Age comics, Joe says the biggest issue he has with Golden and Silver Age comics are that all the thought bubbles make panels look overly bloated. That's pretty specific. I guess so. One of the things, actually, just talking about the transition from like Golden Age comics to now, I like the idea of an internal monologue as opposed to like thought bubbles. There's something, and now we've kind of branched out from the thought bubble and used a couple of different means in order to convey the same sort of purpose. So you look at something like Watchmen, you have, instead of a thought bubble, you have Manhattan's internal monologue, you have Rorschach's journal. You'll have things like that to convey that sort of same, to accomplish the same purpose, but in a much more efficient way. I don't know. I mean, what about you, Bryan? Like, is there anything that besides maybe the art, and the sort of design work that you've noticed going into old stories that don't really click with you?
A lot of the storytelling just wasn't my style. I like the darker, grittier, Alan Moore stuff, definitely. So when it comes to that, it's really hard for me to connect with those stories because, they were written for a specific age group and they weren't allowed to cross certain amount of lines. And it wasn't until the New 52 that we even saw the Joker, really come out of being a jokester of a character and really amount to the individual he is today. Well, that we saw at the end of what was it, Endgame, I believe.
Yeah. And for that, actually, I do have an answer to that. I would highly recommend that you go check out Grant Morrison's Batman. It was the
Yes.
Batman run. It was the biggest Batman run just before New 52. Tony Daniel took over complete writing duties, but there's particularly a story that starts early on in his run, going into Batman the Black Glove and Batman Rest in Peace, that are very Joker heavy,
Mhm.
and it's brilliant. I mean, he's an absolute. I'm gonna use my swear card for the day. He's an absolute fucking psychopath in
Nice.
that book. So check it out. Definitely, you'll love it.
Yeah, I'll get with you later on that one.
Absolutely. The Geek Fortress Dark Knight Nation will be the next big name. I'm calling it. I appreciate that, man. I only hope that to be true. Tevye Smolko says, yep, appreciated. And Joe's Geek Show saying, we're already reviewing his comics. That's a start. That's a start. Make me the next big thing. I'll sign all your comics. You use that to pay for your kids' college tuition, I promise. Let's see. Tevye says, my main problem with old comics is that speech bubbles cover the whole page. Yeah, similar sentiment to what Joe had earlier as well. Mr. DC Comics, The New Frontier is a classic. It reminds people what comics should really be about and presented. I agree. A little bit off topic here, my friend. But yeah, The New Frontier is an absolutely brilliant story that I guess, really it bridges the sort of platforms of old school sensationalism and idealism and the sort of modern, I guess, like socio-political context of comics in a big bad way. Also, Darwin Cook is just an absolute genius. Rest his soul, man. He was taken from us way too soon. But I do kind of want to. I do have a couple questions for you, Bryan, because I think that, again, considering that you and I both started reading comic books somewhere in the 2010s, I think we have a very sort of different approach to comics, how we think about them, how we consider them. And I'm curious for you, and I feel like I might know the answer based on you saying like what your first comic book series was, but what sparked your interest into becoming an adamant comic book reader?
Oh, adamant comic book reader. Honestly, it would have to be The Flash's Year One that came out recently by Joshua Williamson.
Really?
Yeah, that's when I really started picking up the Flash comics and started buying them with every issue and so on and so forth. Because before then, it was just, I pick it up here and there. I check them out. I check out Comics Explained or whatever other, YouTube channels out there. And, that's how I get my comic book feel for the most part. So it wasn't until then that I really, really started collecting them and started buying every issue. And it was Joshua Williamson's storytelling for me. And I know we've talked about how you're not a huge fan of Joshua Williamson with the Flash run. But for me, as a brand new, beginner reader to comic books, Joshua Williamson for me really made it easy for me to connect with the Flash, to be able to understand his stories, and then the artwork on top of that just absolutely blew me away.
Yeah, I think Joshua Williamson, and hear me out, man. It might be surprising that at the beginning of his Rebirth run, The Flash was one of my favorite books coming out. I would say maybe the first 15 to 20 issues of so. I thought it was really good, a nice way to sort of bridge the past into the future. But where I think he does work out better for new readers, or that my problem with him is that I feel like he's rehashing a lot of old stuff. And I feel like he kind of is trying really hard to do what Jeff Johns did for the Green Lanterns, but without as much sort of inspired storytelling. It feels a little bit more, hey, Jeff Johns did the Spectrum, we're going to do all the different forces. Jeff Johns did this, well, I'm going to do this over here, but just make it fast.
Yeah.
And so, that the thing is that Josh Williamson's Flash kind of came around at a time where I was becoming a veteran comic book reader. So it really stopped kind of appealing to me. And then just frankly, I'm a cynical bastard. So just calling a spade, I'm really picking apart the writing and stuff, but it's fair. We're sort of, and I mean, you're a little bit older than me, but we're sort of that generation that were inspired by other media, I think, to get into comics. I know you're a big fan of the CW shows, most profoundly The Flash.
Yep.
And I was like, what was I? I was 11 when the first Iron Man movie came out. I grew
Wow.
up watching, yeah, I grew up watching the Batman animated movies. Um, so, all of that media sort of polymerized inside me and it eventually sort of forced me to go, where do I get more of this? Where do I get more Batman? Where do I get more Superman, Spider-Man, Daredevil, so on and so forth? And I ended up delving into comics. So I find that so interesting about this age is that a lot of us in our early sort of ideas of who these characters are and what their mythologies are and the greater sort of spectrum of it all come from other media, like, God, one of the things that I mean, I was a child, so I guess you can't really blame me, is I never realized, for example, that Dwayne McDuffie was like one of the main creative minds behind the Justice League animated television show. And that
Mhm.
was like the Saturday night cartoon for me. I like my mom canceled like cable for the most part when I was young. And so I used to go to my dad's house when I was a kid because he did have cable strictly so that I could watch my Justice League and Batman and all of that stuff. So I find that interesting because again, you have those readers, who've been reading, like a couple of the guys in the chat here since the 70s, 80s, 90s, whose opinions of the animated stuff and the other media are informed by the comics. And us, it's almost the other way around, like
No, 100%. Like the Flash and stuff of that nature. I hadn't been reading much of the comics prior to watching the show. Like I knew who Barry Allen was. I knew the base of his abilities. I knew who Jay Garrick was. But then they introduced, what was it, Wallace West onto the show as Kid Flash. And that got me wondering, like, where's Wally West? Like, why aren't they using him in here instead? Like, what's going on? And that's why I started diving more into the comic books and actually started getting interesting. So what you say, with the media heavily influenced, especially me, into it. I didn't know anything about X-Men until I watched all the X-Men movies. And the most recent X-Men line that I've been reading has been with the House of X and all the most recent stuff going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so interesting to see that. And that's indicative of like this whole generation. I mean, one of the sort of titles of this video is calling us the new 52 age of readers. And it's not necessarily that like we only read DC or we're only going to talk about the new 52. It is that the sort of image that the big two publishers were going for around that time were trying so desperately to revitalize the industry by welcoming new readers and wiping away continuity to make things feel more accessible, which is ironic because what drove me to comics was I read Final Crisis, which is by Grant Morrison and one of the most confusing, out of this world comic book events, stories, period, of all time. And my first thought was, how the fuck did we get here? And so I started going back. And that, a lot of people have called me an odd duck because they say that they would have been totally discouraged. But for a lot of people, it was that sort of new image, of the new 52. And later, not even a year to two later, Marvel started going through that sort of marketing gimmick of reverting to issue ones at the end of every run and making it feel new, although they never actually rebooted. And that sort of, I don't want to say fresh start because it wasn't a fresh start for everything, but making things look brand new, re-putting all the toys back in the boxes for people to play with, that attracted a new set of readers, like you and I, that came in from media, and you're like, okay, I want to know more. And now it's easier to kind of get in from the ground floor. So, which is interesting because I guess you're a little bit more the rebirth generation of reader, and I guess I would more consider that new 52. But when you started reading the Flash rebirth stuff, what was the thing that made you feel like you wanted to, aside from maybe the YouTube stuff, just what inspired you to go out and branch into other things? What was the impetus behind that?
Honestly, there was like you said, a lot of media, a lot of like magic. The New Mutants came out last year, I think, before that. I wasn't too much into the New Mutants line from X-Men from Hickman right now anyway. But after reading that, I was like, all right, well, I want to find out more about Magic. And so I've started reading more about Magic and her past and all of that stuff here in the last couple of months. And I've actually thoroughly been enjoying it. She's become one of my favorites, along with Captain Marvel too. Both of them have, amazing stories, not just recently, but in the past as well. And that's really how I've been working my comics through is I've been starting recently and been working my way back slowly. It's really hard with DC Comics because their continuity is always changing and ever fluid, and now everything exists. So, DC's been all over the place, but it's nice to go back to those stories like Crisis on Infinite Earths and read that story, read how all that began and how it got to that, because those are amazing stories. I absolutely love them. So, with those ones, I find they're absolutely phenomenal. And yeah, like I said, in the new age, it's really the media that's been grabbing me, bringing me towards other comics. And now that I'm more avid comic reader, I'm just picking up things because I appreciate this artist or this author, so on and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think our generation of reader is much more willing to put characters aside for creators. And definitely correct me if I'm wrong, but obviously I got into it through characters, right? I was like, okay, Batman, we're going to do the Batman stuff, right? And then I branched out, started doing Green Lantern, Flash, eventually turned into the Justice League, so on and so forth. Now I kind of read a little bit of everything. But I'm kind of at the point where if a writer and or artist is doing a book, I don't care what they're doing, I'll read it. Like,
yep.
Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips could do a book about me filling up my water container, and it'd be a fucking kick-ass crime noir. Like, they're just that good. I don't care what they're doing, I'll read it. And yeah, there is that part of me that's like kind of bummed that I'm not reading the mainline Batman story because Batman's my guy. But my loyalty now as a reader is less about the characters and more about where I say I would gauge the capability of the storytelling.
Yep. Yeah, if you have something that's written by Kelly Thompson, you probably already have my money. Like, just because I love how well that she's been doing Captain Marvel line and how well she did with Jessica Jones and stuff of that nature, I'm just absolutely all in with her. But you brought up Batman, which is an interesting thing because Batman for me has been a thing that I've avoided completely just because there has been so much media hype. In the last, 10, 15 years, it's just been Batman movie, Batman this, Batman that, Batman comics. And I was just like, you know what? I'm not even going to cover Batman stuff. I haven't until recently with the Infinite Frontier, just because it's so vital to the core of the story.
I don't blame you, man. Like my right arm is all Batman tattoos. You know what I mean? I got a Two-Face tattoo, got a Court of the Owls tattoo, got a Gotham City tattoo. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't just completely done with the oversaturation of Batman. Now, at this current point in time, because I'm not reading the main Batman title, yeah, am I happy that I'm getting a cool Batman story by Chip Zdarsky and Eddie Barrows in the Urban Legends? Am I happy that I'm getting a Tom King, Andy Kubert Batman story? Yes. But overall, I think that oversaturation dilutes the brand because it's already difficult when you have a character so prestigious that is constantly being touched by so many different hands, and it just warps the image of the character and the mythology of the character, because not only are these visions sometimes often different from each other, but they can be conflicting, and it makes things very difficult for a reader to sort of fasten themselves onto a character. And when you have 4, 5, 6 different Batman books out at a time, frankly, it's confusing. Is Batman the stoic detective type? Is he the Batman from Bendis's Batman universe jumping around doing sort of hokey Silver Age things? Is he the Batman in Tom King's run where he only speaks in one syllable sentences? You don't know what to expect. And it makes kind of things worse because as fans, we're prone to arguing because we have our own interpretations of who these characters are. I've certainly had a great number of arguments with Tom King Batman lovers. I've learned to kind of calm down on it, but everybody has and this applies to all characters, more specifically something like Batman that's so oversaturated. Everybody has their own Batman. Everybody has their own version. And one thing I did want to bring up, and I've kept it on the screen for a while, is the Real Monos' comment, and says people have so many different paths into comics. I loved super cartoons as a kid and followed the characters to the comics. My wife got into them through the Vertigo line. And that's where I kind of want to put a big asterisk, because although Vertigo isn't what got me into comics, Vertigo is what made me want to create comics because of how creatively inspired those stories are. I mean, you have a couple of minor examples, I would say, few so in the last 70s, a little bit more in the late 80s. But when Vertigo comes around, and Karen Berger brings in the British invasion of comics, the Grant Morrisons, Alan Moore, Steve Dillon, Garth Ennis, Brian Bolland, I mean, you could really keep going. There's just like handfuls of people that defined the medium of comic books because they brought all of these different sensibilities in there, and they were inspired by the likes of Frank Miller, and just made comics, I think, credible. You look at that stuff, and I've met people who are perfectly intelligent and able to comprehend highly complex stories, but you give them Grant Morrison's Animal Man and they're like, this is out of my league. And mind you, this is an entire medium that for the greater part of its existence has been thrown away and disregarded as something for children, or people that weren't that didn't have a high intellectual capacity. So Vertigo is really special to me because I loved comics before I got into Vertigo, but Vertigo made me want to live comics, which is different, kind of interesting, because by the time I became super, super, super into comics, DC was already sort of whittling down Vertigo, and to the point where, up until 3 years ago, Vertigo died, basically. And I hope it comes back. Hope comics are cyclical. But good on your wife. She has taste for getting into but I'm curious because I know obviously Bryan, you're really into the superhero stuff. You've delved more into the indie stuff. Have you spent any time looking into Vertigo Comics?
No, I have not. I actually have not heard of them at all.
So Vertigo was an imprint under DC that was meant to sort of mimic creator owned, and it's actually very much the skeleton for modern day Image. Image sort of, I would say, around the time Walking Dead and Saga, started. That was like this wave of Image creators that were inspired by the authorship of Vertigo. Vertigo is where you get, Vertigo was what pulled in Neil Gaiman, Alan Moore.
Gotcha.
Absolute titans in the industry. That's where you get the Sandmans and Why the Last Man, and that's what pulled in Scott Snyder and Jeff Lemire. Basically, all your favorite comic book writers started at Vertigo somewhere, which most people don't think about. So it is like the impetus behind what we now see as modern indie comics, even though it was a sub imprint of DC.
That's pretty unique. I like that.
It's super dope. I will definitely do. I'm like looking at my bookshelf. I will 100% have reading recommendations for you when we get off air.
Yes, please.
But, let's see here. Tevia says what inspired him was 90s X-Men cartoon and 90s Spider-Man cartoon. Yeah, man, absolutely. Mr. DC Comics says, yeah, he was born in 1989, so the 90s DC animation was my life. The Bruce Timm-verse was my era. Also, Paul Dini. Let us give credit where credit is due. But yeah, the beautiful thing about the like 90s, early 2000s DC animation is that they were still telling stories that were digestible for children, but they weren't talking down to them. You look at like if you listen to early interviews of Paul Dini and Bruce Timm talking about, for example, the episode where they introduced Dick Grayson. At the time, Fox wouldn't let them show the Graysons dying. So what did they do? They moved the camera off onto the wall of the tent, and you watch the shadows of the Graysons falling to their death. And that's almost even more impactful than actually watching it happen. And that's what I appreciate so much about it, is because, yes, again, it was for children, but like I'm 23. I can arguably be very pretentious about the things that I absorb, and I will watch Batman animated series any day of the freaking week. It's freaking brilliant. I mean, I got to imagine. Were you big into the DC animated stuff?
Oh yeah, definitely. I was born in 1990, so I was definitely watching that stuff growing up as a kid. Along with Street Sharks and Ninja Turtles and everything else that was coming on at that time. Um, yeah, but they were super huge, especially the Batman animated stuff. And then what was it? I believe it was Batman Beyond was the really first Batman movie that I remember. That's one with George Clooney, right? I believe
Batman
so.
Beyond,
Yes.
Batman Forever.
Batman Forever. That's the one. So Batman Forever was my first introduction to like live action Batman. And so that for me absolutely blew my mind. I was like, I had a crush on Poison Ivy. I wanted to be George Clooney. It was just everything for me. So yeah, the 90s animated and live action stuff really did help drive my love for DC in the early years.
Yeah, there's a whole generation of us that are like that. I mean, you look at writers now. When I read Batman, I hear Kevin Conroy's voice in my head, and it'll be like that until the day I die. And I hope that never goes away. The voice for the Joker in my head is Mark Hamill.
100%.
Tara Strong is my Barbara Gordon. I mean, I was just reading an early preview of Tom Taylor's Nightwing. Lauren Lester's Dick Grayson voice from the animated series is my Nightwing. And I was watching that when I was like 4, dude. Like, that's how immortal that stuff is. Like, I'm turning 24 in a month. That's 20 years that those voices have been so powerful that they've just stuck in my head. And I think that's kind of a beautiful thing,
Oh yeah.
And Tevye, man, you might not have liked the New 52, but it sold like gangbusters when it first started. So failed miserably, I don't think is the way to define it. You look at the early sales of the New 52.
That's actually one thing I wanted to ask you about, because we talked about Scott Snyder a little bit when we were talking about his Nocterra, because you haven't liked anything from Scott Snyder in a while. What do you think of his New 52? Because personally, I did like his New 52 run. I like the Court of Owls. I like the, Talon and William Cobb, all that good stuff building up to Endgame.
His well, the reason I get so hard on him is because his Batman run for me is a top 2 Batman run of all time. I think it's fucking brilliant. It's part of what got me into comics on a monthly basis. It was the Batman number 25 from Zero Year was the first monthly comic I ever picked up, proudly. My first absolute edition is Batman Court of Owls. That's my jam. But there are criticisms to be made of the New 52. Don't get me wrong. They unless you were Batman or Green Lantern, because Green Lantern was still being written by Jeff Johns, your entire continuity got thrown out the window. Yes. Yeah. But there was also a decent amount of really good stuff coming out of that. Like, I know, Tevye, you talk about Tomasi's Superman. His Batman and Robin is absolutely brilliant. I think, and I love Grant Morrison's Batman and Robin. I think Tomasi and Gleason's Batman and Robin is even better, just because of the amount of emotion and personality and character that they bring into it. And freaking Bryan, if you want a good chunky run to read that is just heartfelt superhero storytelling, Batman and Robin by Peter Tomasi, Patrick Gleason, absolutely brilliant. The most uncut, underrated book of the New 52 by far.
I'll have to check it out.
But on that, so yeah, I mean, the New 52 kind of became pitiful. What's the word I'm looking for? Pitiful by the end of its run. It's kind of creatively uninspired, out there, untamed. But it gave us Rebirth, and
yeah,
let's not lie about it. Those first 2 years or so of Rebirth, it's kind of the best DC Comics has been in about 20 years as a whole. So, I don't think saying that the New 52 failed miserably is very accurate. Did they have missteps? Yes, big ones. They forsook a big portion of their readership, but there was a decent amount of good stuff. Says, you made it through Final Crisis and you wanted more. Brave soul. Yeah, I'm an odd duck, man. There's no doubt about it. Let's see. Joe is also talking about an example using the Godspeed storyline and Wally West, Hunter Zolomon story all over again. I'm totally reading that out of context. I am sorry. uh, the Geek Fortress says, I gave up on Future's End, which was basically I kept comparing Future State to Future's End, just in terms of this stopgap that felt totally inconsequential. Which, yeah, I don't blame you. I don't blame you. That wasn't good. They were really desperately trying to recapture the energy behind 52. It failed quite miserably. Let's see. I think let's see. OG says, but Tom King's The Vision was a masterpiece. Listen, I don't like his Batman, but his Vision is fucking brilliant.
Yeah.
Vision, I think, is a top 30 comic book story of all time. I really think it's that good. And I'll be the first person to criticize his Batman, but that Vision is beautiful. It's so beautiful. I mean,
Yeah.
you get to the end of that story and you really work out the sort of the running metaphors of the story, and you look at the reality that the Vision family are so inherently human, even though they're robots, and they don't think that they are, and they're struggling, and it's a lot about sort of identity and how we humanize people, how we dehumanize people. I mean, and just like the running metaphor of the vase of Zen Law just being empty. And it's like, why were you created if you were meant to be empty, as a sort of allegory for the entire Vision family being robots that were created for a purpose that they were never meant to fulfill. Oh my God. It's so good. God, yeah. Let me move on before I turn this into the Vision podcast. The Geek Fortress says, Vertigo is love, Vertigo is life. Very true, my friend. Moving on into sort of the next section of the conversation. I think I've spoken a lot about why I think our perspective as sort of more modern readers make our angle on everything so unique, and I think it's why our voices are equally deserving to be heard amongst the crowd of people that have been reading since the 70s and the 80s. But for you, I think it's kind of pretty fucking ballsy, I think, for you to go out there and start a comic book channel, and having just sort of started reading comics. So for you, what made you feel like, your voice was going to be a contribution into the ether of comic book commentary? Because I feel like a lot of that does, again, sort of stem from your unique perspective and our general unique perspective as this new era of readers that started in the modern age.
Yeah. So really, it felt like a lot of people gave up on DC. And it's really what this all came down to, is people gave up on DC. They gave up on Joshua Williamson. They gave up on the Flash run altogether. And so they stopped covering all these. They stopped talking about these. And so, both from a business perspective and from a comic book loving perspective, I saw an opportunity. I saw an opportunity to fill the gap that nobody else is covering these things. Because regardless if I love the story or not, there's tons of people that are wondering, is DC Comics going to get better? How is it moving forward? How is Future State? How is Infinite Frontier? Is this going to be something that's going to be amazing? We were just talking about Nightwing and how the possibility of that being really good. And, that meaning Infinite Frontier has potential to really revive DC from what it is right now. And so with all this information, I was just like, why not? Why not start covering comics? I absolutely love them. And it got me buying them more. It got me, more invested in these stories, finding out exactly, who Tom King is, what he's wrote, who Grant Morrison is, what he's done. Why is he significant? Who's Jim Lee? Why is everybody want his signature at Comic Cons? You know what I mean? So it's trying to piece all that together. And like you said, it was very ballsy. I make mistakes constantly on my channel because I don't know a lot of, like, especially when it comes like to the X-Men and Marvel stuff. Like I am very ignorant to a lot of it. And so, I ask people to work with me on that stuff because I'm still learning, like I said, the House of X is my new line. That's my X-Men. I understand the X-Men that came before it, but I've never read those comics. A few of the major lines I have, but outside of that, I haven't really dove into the real in-depth writing of it. And so for me, the comic books that really matter are the ones that I'm reading right now. Those are the ones that are holding the most impact for me. And so, like I was saying, the line is just, it's really with like House of X and stuff like that. I'll mess up lines and stuff like that. But outside of that, I am learning so much, and it's a constant learning curve. I'm constantly going back and reading old stories to help connect continuity and so on and so forth.
And it's really enriching, I think, when you, sometimes it can be difficult, but when you can surround yourself with the people that have that sort of historical knowledge, you read something, you're like, they're referencing something here that I don't quite know about. And if frankly, if the story is if the writer is good enough, they're able to make the story feel fulfilling without you feeling like you're really missing out by lacking that little bit of context. But when you can go back and absorb that for yourself, that material, and get that reference, it just enriches the overall experience. And I totally understand you for that. That was, I mean, for me, you read like the Grant Morrison Batman run, and what it was really famous for was taking old Golden and Silver Age concepts and like remodernizing them. I mean, he made Batmite, right? You've all seen Batmite, the little fifth dimensional imp. He made that legitimate as a sort of manifestation of Batman's psychotic breakdown in Batman Rest in Peace. That's brilliant, and it makes me appreciate that weird old wacky Silver Age Batmite story that I might have looked down upon, but when you look at what Grant Morrison was able to do, by having such a reverence to that material and bringing it into the modern age, it just makes the overall experience of being a comic book fan of something with this massive sort of library and history so much more valuable. I think, there's that constant debate about whether or not we need to maintain continuity, and it's a fine line to walk, but generally I think what makes Marvel and DC stand out, from these brilliant indie publishers that have been popping up and putting out these great stories, are that they have history. They have a sense of legacy. You look at Batman, you're like, man, I mean, just in general, you look at those characters, you look at the Justice League, they are the American pantheon of gods, right? They are the characters that we tell stories about, that inspire children. I mean, I guarantee you, every single one of you listening to this right now, at some point, your mother or whoever hits you with the, you can't be strong like Superman if you don't eat your vegetables. And that was the selling point, to eat your fucking broccoli. You know what I mean? Like something that simple, and seeing how these characters have permeated our lives on such an intimate level, and just using that as a sort of stupid example, it says a lot. And as much as I love, and I've been a big proponent of indie, that is so unique to Marvel and DC.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about Kite Man when you were talking about that, because Kite Man is a prime example of a character that was taken, that was really just a big joke. He was a guy that flies around a kite. He was someone to punch. And, he was used like that in the New 52, but they really gave him a story that made you connect with him on such a level that it's like, all right, now I got to find out who Kite Man is. Like, I got to find out when he was created. I got to find out who created him. I got to find out what storyline he has and how is he revamped for this new era of comic books.
Yeah, I mean, Tom King definitely has a couple like really interesting moments, and the fact that Kite Man has become like in a very sort of small dose, like just a pop culture icon being thrown into that Harley Quinn animated television show, which admittedly I know that looks like something I wouldn't like. I thought the first season was fucking hilarious. Yeah, second season lost me a little bit because it was like, oh, you're trying really hard to recapture the magic of season one. And season one, what I liked about that, without going too far, is that it was kind of effortless, and they knew what they were trying to do, and they were just kind of unapologetic about it. Like, we're not doing the next show in the Bruce Timm DCAU. We're gonna make fun of everything, and we're gonna use a nonsensical character like Harley Quinn to do it. So yeah, great example.
It's made me love Clayface. I'm interested in Clayface now because of that show.
You should check out man, you're definitely gonna want to have to go back and get all these recommendations by watching the stream again. But during Rebirth, I don't know if you've read it. James Tynan's Batman run did a lot of really cool stuff with Clayface in a
I don't
very
think I
big.
did read his run.
It's pretty good. I mean, it definitely has its ups and downs, but what's being done with Clayface throughout, I think, is particularly one of the highlights. So, yeah, he's a consistent supporting cast member of that series. Definitely check it out. Let's see. The Geek Fortress. How many issues with that Vision run? I actually have not read it. 12, I believe. It's 2 trades. I'm looking up at them right now. So I believe it's 12 issues. One of the volumes is Better Than Man. No, I don't remember. I don't remember the names of the volumes, but you can definitely find them. If not, hit me up later, Lewis. I know my LCS just ordered new copies of those trades, so I can talk to them maybe about getting them in your hands. So, yeah, hit me up, dude. Definitely worth the read. But yeah, I mean, the interesting thing too, I think, of modern comic book readers, and some of us do fall into the traps of diminishing comics down and only really valuing them for the superhero beat 'em up stories. But what I genuinely think is great about most of the people that I've read that have come into this new age are that they accessed comics at a formative time in their lives where comics were already telling these more complex stories that were more relatable, and that were a little bit more literary to a degree. You know, they weren't throwaway newspaper stories anymore. They were people conveying their experiences through these iconic characters, or even doing something different, you know, through something like Image or IDW or Dark Horse or what have you. But I think that it also sort of appeals to this sort of sentiment that is a lot more modern in that I think we value character-driven stories now in entertainment more than ever. You know, back in the day, you could watch an old school Western and it was just about the environment and the cool cowboys and the outlaws and the saloon and the occasional dust bunny, you know, rolling by. But now, you know, we want to read a story about the who, what, when, where, and why. And a lot of that revolves around characters and their emotions and their psychology. So, you know, I mean, for me, again, like, I definitely tend to lean sometimes on the pretentious side, but I definitely don't shy away from the fact that, like, I got an entire, like, 2 shelves of Batman comics. You know, want to know why? Because we can tell very intimate stories with a character like that, you know, and that level of versatility. So for you, you know, Bryan, I mean, I know you love like the high energy, high action and stuff, but when you read like a comic book story, are there any sort of particular angles that appeal to you on a deeper level? And are there any sort of specific instances that you can think of that you read in a comic book or maybe access something through a character that made you feel something?
Yeah, actually, there's one I just read recently. It was actually an indie comic. It's called the OZ, which stands for the Occupied Zone. Do you have a copy of it? Yes. Yes. So that comic was absolutely brilliant. And it connected with me on such a way because I'm an Iraq veteran. You know, she's an Afghanistan veteran. So we're both veterans of the Middle East. We both, you know, we're in the war zone in the same time era. And so I connected on such a deep level with that because her trip into the land of Oz is really her dealing with her post-traumatic stress disorder. And to further on that, you know, that was a great comment. But Heroes in Crisis, actually, we've talked about this before because Heroes in Crisis was a big deal to me because it was superheroes dealing with their PTSD, dealing with their trauma, dealing with all of these things when they're, you know, from the outside, you know, especially as a soldier, you're meant to always be at top notch. You're always supposed to appear to not be broken. But really, you know, most of us, especially as infantry guys, they're broken as hell. And it's individuals like Superman coming out and saying, you know, we're broken people too. We're humans at the end of the day. We have feelings, we have emotion. and we do our best to overcome that, and that's why we have this place, this sanctuary, so on and so forth. So for that, you know, I know it wasn't well received at all, but for me, Heroes in Crisis was one of the biggest emotional connections to a story I've ever felt.
Yeah, that's fair. I think it was one of those stories that the concept really hooked me, and I think the execution really fell through. I love the idea of it, and I love the sentimentality of it, and I think it's super relevant and organic. But I didn't much care for the way they executed it. I thought it came off as kind of as a misunderstanding of a lot of those characters and heavy-handed, and I felt like he kind of tried to mold characters to fit his purpose rather than choosing characters that fit the purpose more
Yeah.
organically. But nonetheless, yeah, I mean, it was relevant, and just, you know, giving Tom King his credit, and on a run that I particularly as a whole didn't like. His first issue of Batman made me cry.
Really?
Yeah, when Bruce is very simply trying to stop that plane from crashing into the center of Gotham, and he has this beautiful dialogue with Alfred, where he's contemplating his own death, and he thinks that, you know, he's going to go down because he can't get in touch with any of the League, and it's this sort of beautiful story about a man who is something that is inherently so much greater than what we can amount to be, who is about to die this very helpless death, but doing his best to make it meaningful. And man, I remember reading through it, and at the end of the dialogue, he asked Alfred, he's like, "Would they be proud? Is this a good death?" And I was like, "Fuck, man." that like, oh my God, that's just, it makes me emotional just thinking about it. And that's you know, that's powerful, because again, these characters are our icons. They are our moral center. You know, like Superman is looked at as the ideal of what it is to be a good American, you know, and even more so what it is to be a good person, although he isn't human. And on that, actually, the Geek Fortress, who's in the chat, him, I, and Comic Boom did a really great stream that I think is evergreen, that you should all check out, on why the world needs Superman now, a couple months back. So go check that out at the end of this episode. I think that, I mean, Lewis had a lot of really great things to add to that conversation, but I think as a whole, it's one of my favorite live streams I've ever done. But you know, again, I think there, and this isn't all, this whole conversation isn't to rail on the guys that have been reading comics for longer than I've been alive. I think it's just to highlight the fact that you can pick comic book readers from each sort of generation or each era that started, and find something very particularly unique about the way that they approach these things. And what where I give our generation of reader a lot of credit is, again, that we're not as beholden, you know, to the past. And while we want to see it respected, we also want to see characters move in a new modern direction that is relatable. You know, I think a lot of people look at these characters and they're like, oh, well, you know, I need Barry Allen to never make a mistake. I need Barry Allen to be a god. And that, you know, the sensibility now is that we want characters that we can relate to. You know, they are us, given a tremendous amount of power and responsibility. And what happens with that? And yes, there is an angle that you look at the Justice League and they're practically all gods, but how does that interact with their humanity, and how is that individual to each of their upbringings and you know, each different walk of life, and how they sort of deal and reconcile with all that is sort of brilliant. And it's what makes comics, and superhero comics in particular, I think, a lot more readily available to tell these highly emotional, intellectual, relatable stories. And you know, it's yes, as a kid I was drawn to Batman because he was the big scary guy, like jumping from rooftops and beating up the bad guys. But now I look at Batman as the pinnacle of what we're meant to be, to take the things that push us down and rear, you know, our fucking beaten head against it and push back, you know, to be stronger than the sum of the forces that are weighing down upon us, no matter what happens. And you know, various things can be said about a lot of these characters. So And I think that is particularly unique again to our generation, because we do look at these characters with a little bit more sort of meaning. They are um, a lot more multifaceted. And that's sort of what I think is so great about looking at comics now and what they're available to do in the modern age. And, you know, I mean, I think we will and are sort of entering a time that is a sort of reinvigoration of creativity in the industry, um, because of how well indie comics have been doing right now. I think they're actually the driving force. I'm hearing more and more in the mainstream about books coming from Boom or coming from Image or big name creators that want to go back to their roots and tell stories that are theirs, that are unrestricted. And I think and I hope that will force the big two companies to look at that and adapt and move in a somewhat similar direction in the best way they possibly can.
Yeah, no, I agree. I really, I can only speak for myself, but I really want to see character development. Excuse me. These are heroes that have existed for almost a century now. Like there's only so many stories and so much you can tell about these characters, and I love hearing about them, and I will love continue to hear about them. But one of my friends actually really did put it in perspective for me when it comes to the sake of diversity. And I'm not talking about like changing Superman to like Clark Kent to a black guy or anything like that, but I'm talking in the essence. Like my buddy, he's half Mexican, half black. He's like my brother. We served together in the military, all that. And with Miles Morales, Spider-Man, it really helped him connect to comic books in a way that he has never been able to connect to before. Because comic books, he loves Marvel more than I do, and having someone like Miles to be able to have some kind of representation is absolutely huge for him. He adores it. He loves it. He cosplays as them, and I really see that as the direction that comic books are going. We're creating new characters, creating new storylines. And I think all of this is great as long as, we're not hurting the legacies, because they are important at the end of the day. These are the characters that literally built us to where we are, and we can't tarnish those names. We can't hurt those names. One day I think it would be good to see those characters die off or retire or whatever the case may be. Eventually, not anytime soon. But I would like to see that, and I would like to see a new era taking over, because like I said, you've got a century worth of comics on these one characters. You got to change it up. You got to bring us something new. You got to introduce us to a whole new landscape, or you're just going to be repeating stories over and over.
Yeah. And I think to many degrees, I definitely agree with that. And I think that this generation of reader is a little bit more willing to do that, because we're seeing, all these different characters like Miles pop up that are worthy successors of these mantles, that we love and that we don't want to see go away. But, and I've been saying this for years, mostly because I do know that comics are cyclical, and no matter what, we'll always come back to the DC universe with Bruce Wayne, Clark Kent, and Diana Prince. But even if it's just for a little while, give us a world where the second generation picks up the mantle, right? I mean, we've seen in isolated doses where that happens, with Dick becoming Batman, Wally becoming Flash. Why don't we move ahead to the future and see what a world looks like where the principal superheroes are all the second generations? All of them are trying to live up to the mantles of their predecessors and trying to set out for something new. What does that mean in the context when they are now the mentor figures as well, right? What does that even mean for our old heroes from time to time, that we go back and we look at them and see where they are now? And it will totally change the pecking order, right? Like, if you were to do that, DC's new Trinity wouldn't be Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman anymore. Yeah, Batman would be in there because Dick Grayson's experience, but your new Trinity would be Batman as Dick Grayson, Wally West as the Flash, and either Donna Troy, Wonder Woman, or even Garth as Aqualad. Like, there's just so much more of a range, and a diversity of not only character but of content, that'll bring you. And I've been a big proponent of that. And Bruce Wayne's my favorite fictional character of all time. Don't get me wrong, but I'm ready to see a DC universe for maybe the next 5 to 10 years where maybe Bruce Wayne steps out of the role of Batman, and it have to be all of this. Obviously, let me just put the caveat out there. I don't want it to just happen. It needs to all be done organically. We need to make that transition and do it right by the characters and the legacy. But I would be, I think, satisfied in seeing that as a possible next step, in superhero comics.
Yeah, I mean, even with Future State, they still tiptoed around getting rid of the Trinity. I mean, honestly, the Future State Batman line, the next Batman, was really about Batman. Like, at the end of the day, it was about finding Batman. Batman's missing, where's Batman? And they didn't really focus too much on Jace. He had his little run, but it wasn't like they even had to introduce Bruce Wayne into that. The only one that really was unique on its own, it was what, Aquaman, right?
Yeah.
It was the only one that was uniquely away from the core characters. And I just feel like, DC just didn't want to risk assaulting or offending fans by removing the core team, the Trinity, and moving into something, even if it's temporarily, for Future State.
Yeah, I mean, it's at the end of the day, to those bigger companies especially, it all comes down to the cheddar. Like what happens, where's their money moving based on those decisions. And unfortunately right now DC is run by a tech company that doesn't know anything about comic books, so hopefully we see some things rectified and that they're able to adjust. But hey, that's just me. I mean, I think this has been a really, really great conversation, about our stance and sort of where we're coming from, because I think what's great is that, although, for example, you and I kind of come from the same generation of reader, we also have two very different perspectives on what we think about comics and what we think they are or should be. And that's kind of a beautiful thing. Like, I love the fact that you love Carol Danvers, because I don't give a shit about Carol Danvers. And that's kind of great. Like, that's so great that we both love comics, but we can love them in very different ways. Like, and I don't know, that sort of diversity of thinking and of content, that's what makes it so great. That's why you see stories, right? Like guys like Jeff Lemire can go and do, a century story at Marvel, and then go do a question story at DC. And that's what makes the diversity of thought so brilliant, in a medium like this. And especially, with characters and legacies that mean so much to different people. So first of all, if you guys like this video, click the like button down below. Subscribe to my channel. Go click the link in the description. Subscribe to Bryan's channel. I think both of us have very unique voices in the comic book sort of review space, if I do say so myself. Again, bringing everything that we talked about in this conversation to our individual content, which is great. Bryan, are there any sort of final words that you want to give to the people at home before we outro us out?
Start reading indie comics. Start buying indie comics, start supporting indie comics, start supporting Kickstarters like Area 51, the Helix Project. There's tons of amazing stories out there. I love Marvel and DC just as much as everybody else, but these indie comic creators are really coming up here, and I want to see these indie companies really start competing against the big two. I don't want it to be the big two anymore. I want it to be the big 10. I want it to be the big 20. I want, like Unparalleled Comics. It's one of my favorite indie comic lines right now. They have like 7 or 8 comics. They're creating their own universe. And I absolutely love seeing this universe building, because eventually I plan on writing a book and so on and so forth. And this is exactly the kind of worlds I want created. And it's awesome seeing people create that. And I really hope, people got the chance with the pandemic to actually stay inside and start writing and drawing and be creative and artistic. And I hope, as the pandemic starts to wind down, people go back to work, that we can keep that creativity, and these people that want to be creators or are creators keep putting out amazing stuff that can start taking my money.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Go read indie comics. On that, I got an indie comic for you guys. So check out the link in the description below. Area 51, the Helix Project. I would super duper appreciate it. We're at about $4,300. We have 2 weeks left. Have another $2,500 to make, just about. And I can promise you that you will 100% get your money's worth. I'm bringing all of that sort of critical and thoughtfulness that I bring to this comic book content into making a story that I think matters, that I think is entertaining. And I think I've surrounded myself with people that take what I want to do and make it even better. So, please consider giving it a look. And again, if you enjoyed the video, please make sure to subscribe to both of our channels, like this video, all of those shenanigans. And if you end up enjoying any of our stuff, whether it's my videos, Bryan's videos, my comic book, share them with friends, build this community of open-minded people that love to talk about comics, that love to engage with this material, and one where we can just be passionate. So I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Bryan, thank you so much for sitting down and being a part of the conversation. It was great to have you on Let's Talk Comics.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So with all that being said, guys, I want to thank you guys so much again for watching. This has been Dark Knight Nation and Bryan from Comic Breakdown, and we will catch you guys next week with another great episode of Let's Talk Comics.